Hollywood has always been a place of carefully constructed illusions, a world where studios manufactured not just films, but entire identities. Smiles were perfected under studio lights, scandals were quietly buried, and the public was handed a version of its favorite stars that was polished, heroic, and entirely fictional. But Paul Newman, one of the industry's most respected and clear-eyed figures, saw through it all. Over decades of interviews and private conversations, he named names, men and women whose celebrated careers concealed behavior that ranged from cruelty to outright criminality. These are the stories Hollywood spent decades trying to erase. Joan Crawford, the monster behind the Oscar. Few contradictions in Hollywood history are as striking as Joan Crawford's. In 1946, she accepted her Academy Award for Mildred Pierce in a luminous white gown, the picture of elegance and triumph. The industry cheered, the public swooned, and that very same night, according to a maid who later testified, Crawford returned to her Brentwood mansion and dragged her 11-year-old daughter Christina from her bed, forced her to sing the national anthem, and slapped her so hard the sound echoed through the halls. Paul Newman, reflecting on Crawford in a 1979 interview with the New York Times, leaned back and said quietly, "Never believe an Oscar can hide the darkness in a family." Joan Crawford is the clearest proof. Christina Crawford would grow up to describe her childhood as a gilded hell. Wire coat hangers became instruments of punishment. Ashtrays became weapons. Long sleeves worn in the heat of July concealed bruises no one was permitted to see. Emotional torture was equally ritualized. An hourglass placed in her room forced her to kneel before a crucifix with punishments doubled for the slightest infraction. What made it all the more disturbing was the industry's complicity. While Crawford beat her daughter backstage, Hollywood placed her on magazine covers celebrating her as the perfect mother. Witnesses recalled Christina being struck minutes before posing for photographs with a practiced smile. Even in death, Crawford found a way to punish. When her will was read in 1977, the room froze at a single line cutting Christina and her brother Christopher out entirely, for reasons which they well know. One attorney present whispered that it was the only time he had ever seen a mother take revenge from beyond the grave. Bing Crosby, the jailer dressed as an angel. If Joan Crawford represented cruelty hidden behind beauty, Bing Crosby represented something perhaps even more unsettling, evil concealed behind warmth. To the world, Crosby was the man who gave them White Christmas, the gentle, resonant voice that NBC proudly called America's model dad. Life magazine praised him as the perfect father. Paul Newman saw something entirely different. In a 1982 Esquire interview, he described Crosby without hesitation. "They call him the King of Christmas. To me, he was a jailer dressed as an angel." Behind the walls of Crosby's home, his children lived in a state of chronic terror. His eldest son, Gary, later wrote about hiding in corners at night, clutching a pillow to his chest, listening for the sound of his father's belt. On Larry King Live, Gary broke down, recalling that his father never once embraced him, only stared coldly before he swung. The trauma rippled devastatingly through the family. Lindsay Crosby spent years in psychiatric care, unable to hear Christmas music without trembling. Dennis Crosby died by suicide in 1989, leaving behind a heartbreaking note. "Every Christmas, the nightmare comes back. I'm too tired." Lindsay took his own life a year later. A former tour musician told the Los Angeles Times he once heard shouting, a crack, a child sobbing, then silence, and knew that speaking up would have ended his career. Newman rejected every attempt to excuse Crosby's behavior by pointing to a difficult upbringing. At a 1985 panel, he said flatly, "Don't blame his childhood. He beat his kids because he enjoyed the power." The industry, dependent on Crosby's wholesome image, chose silence. The truth stayed buried beneath the sound of White Christmas. Errol Flynn, arrogance without consequence. Errol Flynn arrived in Hollywood like a myth made flesh. When The Adventures of Robin Hood premiered in 1938, audiences were instantly captivated. Photoplay crowned him the man every woman longed for and every man wanted to be. But behind the swashbuckling persona, Darker rumors circulated constantly through Beverly Hills and along Sunset Strip. Everything exploded into public view in 1942 when Flynn was charged with the sexual assault of two underage girls. The Los Angeles Examiner ran the case across its front pages under the headline, "Robin Hood in the Dock." Prosecutors describe wild parties in a Hollywood Hills apartment where, according to one witness, Flynn walked in like a king, surrounded by faces far too young to understand such luxury. The courthouse overflowed with reporters and devoted fans. Flynn was ultimately acquitted, but his behavior upon walking free said everything. He lit a cigarette, smirked, and announced, "The ladies will still love this Robin Hood." Newman later said he had never witnessed arrogance so nakedly displayed. Insiders knew that powerful studio machinery and carefully managed press relationships had helped protect Flynn throughout the trial. Reporter Sheila Graham wrote in 1945 that if Flynn's mansion walls could speak, Hollywood would never want to hear the stories, tales of days-long parties, underage guests, and an environment where refusal was not an option. When Flynn died in 1959 at just 50, his body so ravaged that a coroner noted it resembled that of a much older man. Hollywood chose to preserve only the legend. The shadows were buried alongside him. Mickey Rooney, the boy star with a violent edge, Elizabeth Taylor, one of Hollywood's most beloved figures, was not easily frightened. But in 1974, during a private conversation Paul Newman later recounted to Vanity Fair, she broke down speaking about her early MGM years and whispered, "You don't understand. Mickey Rooney frightened me more than anyone." It was that moment, Newman said, that he truly understood how dark the boy star's hidden life had been. During the 1930s and 40s, Rooney was MGM's single greatest asset. The Andy Hardy films made him a symbol of American innocence, and Life magazine put him on its cover as the little star with the biggest smile. But behind the scenes, crew members described explosive hair-trigger outbursts and a temper that turned violent in seconds. What haunted Taylor most was what had happened when she was just 14. Freshly famous from National Velvet, she became the target of Rooney. Then nearly 25 and already a towering star, who began pursuing her relentlessly. A classmate recalled Taylor wearing thick sweaters in summer specifically to avoid his gaze and whispering, "I just want to get out of here." Her diaries from that period spoke of sleepless nights and the feeling of being trapped inside MGM's golden cage. The studio protected Rooney completely. When columnist Hedda Hopper attempted to hint at his behavior, MGM forced a retraction within 24 hours. Taylor carried that trauma into adulthood, falling silent whenever his name was mentioned. When Newman was asked about Rooney at a press conference in 1982, he said quietly, "Hollywood has smiles that hide darkness." Mickey Rooney was the clearest proof. Bette Davis and Marlene Dietrich, queens of fear. Not all of Hollywood's darkness was predatory in nature. Some of it was simply the brutality of unchecked power. Bette Davis was celebrated as one of the greatest actresses who ever lived, and that reputation was not unearned. But those who worked alongside her frequently encountered a woman who weaponized her status with devastating effect. A Warner Brothers makeup artist remembered watching her charm journalists 1 minute, then unleash on a supporting actor the next for standing an inch out of place. On the set of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? In 1962, her feud with Joan Crawford, who was no innocent herself, turned the production into what Variety called a battlefield. Davis shoved Crawford with enough force to send her to the hospital, then responded to the news with characteristic bluntness. If she got hurt, that's her problem. Newman, who once witnessed Davis publicly humiliate a young actress, said simply, "No one denies Betty's talent, but I've never seen a woman spread so much fear on a set." Marlene Dietrich operated differently, not through rage, but through cold, calculated seduction. She moved through Hollywood like a predator selecting its prey, treating every relationship as a power game to be won. Gene Gabin, considered her great love, withdrew into depression after she left him. Writer Eric Maria Remarque watched his royalties drain away as she financed an extravagant lifestyle from his earnings. Edith Piaf spiraled into alcohol and pills following their affair. A young actress who abandoned her career to follow Dietrich died by suicide, leaving behind a note with just 3 words, "I hate you." Dietrich's own daughter, Maria Riva, wrote that growing up in her mother's world meant watching people treated as props, discarded the moment their usefulness expired. Newman, who somehow managed to avoid her orbit, described her with clinical precision. Marlene treated emotion like playing cards. She played better than anyone, but behind her, all you saw were losers. Kirk Douglas, Wallace Beery, and the industry's silence. Some of Hollywood's darkest chapters involved not just individual misconduct, but the full, institutional power of the studio system working to conceal it. Kirk Douglas was celebrated as the embodiment of cinematic heroism, the defiant slave rebel of Spartacus, the fearless knight of a dozen epics. But whispers about his predatory behavior toward very young women had circulated since the 1950s, quietly buried by studios who considered him too profitable to sacrifice. The most disturbing allegation involved Natalie Wood. In 1954, when she was just 15 years old, she was taken by her mother to the Chateau Marmont for what was described as a mentoring meeting with Douglas. According to her sister Lana's memoir, the teenager returned hours later shaken and in tears, writing in her diary, "I must stay silent if I want to keep acting, but I feel filthy." Hollywood kept the story hidden for decades, even after Wood's mysterious drowning in 1981. Newman said on 60 Minutes, "Spartacus may have been a hero. Kirk Douglas was never a hero, not to the young girls he hunted." Wallace Beery presented a similar portrait of protected villainy. In the 1930s, audiences adored his gruff tenderness on screen, and Variety praised him as having a heart of gold beneath a shell of steel, but his name became permanently linked to the 1937 death of Ted Healy, founder of the Three Stooges. Witnesses claimed a large man matching Beery's description was seen fighting with Healy outside the Trocadero nightclub the night. Healy was found beaten to death in his hotel room. 3 days later, MGM quietly sent Beery to Europe. Police ruled the death alcohol-related, though journalists at the time suggested studio interests may have played a role in shaping that conclusion. Former child actors alleged he was physically violent on set. Gloria Swanson wrote in her memoir that he had been brutally violent during their marriage. Newman, asked about Beery in 1981, said Hollywood had long known the rumors but consistently chose to protect a profitable legend over an uncomfortable truth. What Paul Newman understood, the through line connecting all of these stories is not simply individual cruelty. It is a system, one that decided again and again that fame was worth more than justice, that box office returns mattered more than the suffering of children, young women, and anyone unfortunate enough to stand in the way of a star's ego or appetite. Paul Newman understood this system intimately, and his willingness to name it, carefully, quietly, without fanfare, stands as one of the most honest acts of any figure from Hollywood's golden age. He wasn't just listing names. He was describing a machine, and in doing so, he forced the question that Hollywood has never quite been able to answer. How many more stories are still buried,